Okay, everybody, listen. Apologies for that that start. As like I said, it's probably in good keeping with the way we've all had to respond and adapt during this pandemic. So I'd like to start with a thanks to the University of the West of Scotland for the invite, actually, to be here to share just some of our experiences of policing the pandemic within Police Scotland. I'm very much surprised to see so many of you wanted to hear about the pandemic as we continue to navigate our way through it. So my thanks to everybody that signed on, and I will try and leave lots of time at the end for questions and discussions. The purpose, I suppose, today is really just to take you on a bit of a COVID-19 journey, very much from a policing perspective, and to share some of the challenges and some of the considerations that informed our policy decisions and our response as we continue to navigate the pandemic. Like I said, I'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions, which hopefully I will be able to answer. But of course, there may be some that I can, and if I can, I'll certainly take a note of it and come back to you in due course. So why me, I suppose? So for those who don't know me, I'm Mark Sutherland, a Chief Superintendent with Police Scotland, and my current role is the Divisional Commander for Greater Glasgow, which includes Glasgow City, East Renfrewshire and East Dunbartonshire. But going back to just before the pandemic, my job was here in Greater Glasgow as a superintendent, and I had the operations and event planning portfolio, and with that came business continuity and resilience. And the early part of our focus, which I'll come on to, was very much round about that business continuity and resilience as we prepared for the pandemic and tried to second guess what was coming from elsewhere in Europe and far beyond. I then moved to a couple of national roles, specifically dealing with our response to the pandemic. Firstly, coordinating nationally the local policing arrangements, and then secondly, as a Chief Superintendent, leading our business continuity, resourcing and performing the role of Deputy Silver Commander as we led the overall response on behalf of Police Scotland. And then in September, that brought me back to back to Greater Glasgow as the Divisional Commander. And so I've got quite a vast experience of different areas of how we've managed to navigate through the pandemic as we continue. So, and I'm also joined by Sergeant Kevin Dougal, and Kevin is a very experienced sergeant who, during the pandemic, has been performing a temporary inspector role in the south side of Glasgow, and Kevin will give us an operational overview as we go through the presentation today. The only caveat that I would like to share is round about the data. You will see some data later on in the presentation as management information data and shouldn't be treated as official statistics, but I can explain that in a wee bit more detail for anybody who needs to know it. We do publish the data nationally anyway, and you'll see that as we go through the presentation. So Ross, if we can just maybe move on to the next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so this first one is preparing for the pandemic. So a bit like every other agency, whether that's law enforcement, any business, any other public body, and preparing for the pandemic was in some ways a bit of a shot in the dark, trying to anticipate what this might look like. And we had lots of different planning assumptions and lots of worst case scenarios, thankfully a lot of which didn't come to fruition, certainly during the first wave of what we saw. So it was in early 2020 that we were watching with real interest to see what this latest SARS disease in the Far East would bring. I suppose, like most, if not all agencies and companies, we did not foresee quite how challenging and how enduring, I think, and importantly, this pandemic would become. I think we thought we were in it for the short term in terms of months, rather than what has almost become a full year now and looks to go well beyond. But our early focus was all about readiness. We already had pandemic planning within our business continuity arrangements. And so the early part was very much spent looking at this area and refreshing and updating it. So the types of things that we began looking at were how might we better use resources? What would we do less of or even stop? How would we need to change the level of service that we deliver to the public, and how would we communicate that? How would the public understand what our ask and level of service would be? But I'm pleased and indeed proud to say that we've never really fully changed the level of service that we deliver to the public. And I'll come on to talk later about how we did reduce some forms of contact and some forms of attendance. But in essence, we have never stopped serving the public when they needed the police. If someone needed police attendance, we've been able to deliver that throughout the entire pandemic, no matter how our absence levels or the challenges we've had around about health and safety and PPE. So we have changed and we have adapted, but as I said, we have still been able to deliver for those who have most needed us. If we can just move on, please, Ross, thanks.
Is that okay, Mark?
Yeah, that's us now, thank you.
All right.
And so part of the way that we do that is through our command structure, along with that business continuity, which I've spoken about. Like any organisation, you need a management structure that can deliver the needs of your own business. And command structures like the one that you see here are typically stood up for a variety of instances and ensures that we can respond both in how we as an organisation support our own officers and staff, but also in the policing response that you see on the streets. The command structure you can see here is the one that we've been using for what we call Operation Tala, which is our response to the COVID pandemic. And we implemented this command structure very early in 2020, and we have changed it slightly as has been required to respond to different waves of the pandemic and where different functions have been required. But it's been broadly the same since the outset, and it's very much supported our response. You'll see a lot of functional leads under the gold and silver commander in this diagram, and they will ultimately report into the gold commander, who in our case has been Deputy Chief Constable Malcolm Graham, who has had overall responsibility for the decision making and our response. But of course, there are a lot more people involved than just the senior staff on the command structure, and indeed the frontline officers that you see out in the street. That also includes our service advisors taking calls through 101 and 999. Health and safety, who advise on ways to make sure we are protecting our own people, and many, many others. And of course, like lots of other organisations, our cleaning staff and other staff that support our indoor spaces have become even more important as we've managed through the pandemic. We would have a number of gold and silver meetings on a weekly basis, in fact a daily basis in the early stages and at certain other times. And these are also attended by the Scottish Police Federation, the Association of Police Superintendents and our trade unions. And they play a vital and key role in supporting and scrutinising the police response. The Federation get the responses from their frontline officers on the ground, and it's vitally important that they're able to offer challenge and support. And there had been times such as the response to drink driving, like in any partnership, where we have not always seen eye to eye, but I think having the federations and the unions has been absolutely critical. And on the whole, it's been a very positive relationship and one which I've very much valued as we've moved through. Ross, can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. And so we move on to policing the pandemic and the first wave of legislation, if you like, and the kind of question was, can we police our way out of the pandemic? Can the police enforce this lockdown to a level where the virus is driven underground and dissipates? And from early on, it was clear that policing would play a vital role in supporting the collective effort to protect the NHS and save lives. There were extraordinary powers granted to us during what is an unprecedented time. While normally we would have months or even years to prepare for new legislation, the coronavirus regulations were implemented very quickly, and at a time when additional guidance came into force which was not in law. So we had to be really clear with our own officers on what was legislation and what was guidance only, and how we wanted them to respond. And the public were in the same position as they adjusted quickly to new ways of working and living and adapting to changing guidance and legislation. And so the answer, as we knew from the outset, was no, we cannot police our way out of the pandemic, but the police most definitely have a very important role to play. And so we had to develop an approach that was consistent and fair, but still supported the public health pandemic appropriately. Have the next slide, please, thanks. Thank you. And so, what was our approach? Well, the Chief Constable was clear from the outset that our policing style and tone would focus on engaging with the public. We police by consent in Scotland, and that has remained at the cornerstone of our approach. We also knew that the public were being asked to make lots of very difficult and large sacrifices, and that rules had been introduced quickly. So it was important that our officers were able to explain the rules and encourage compliance. Only if there was a blatant and willful breach would we move to enforce the legislation. And all we've ever asked of our frontline officers and staff is to engage the public, to have a common sense conversation that supports the spirit of the restrictions in the legislation, to encourage compliance and to enforce only when it has been necessary and proportionate and as a last resort. Of course, time has moved on since we developed this particular approach, and in 10 months on into the pandemic, we rightly expect the public to have a greater understanding of the rules and regulations. And where there have been flagrant breaches of the COVID regulations, we are now in a position where we will move quicker to enforcement where that breach is clear and obvious. And you'll see there, and you'll have seen this in the public domain many times, the 4 E's approach that we have taken throughout the pandemic to engage and to ask whether individuals are aware of the legislation, to explain the risks to the public health, to encourage that compliance, and only to enforce where it is necessary and as time has gone on, where there is a real flagrant disregard for public safety. Next slide, please, thanks. Okay, so we move on now to talk about managing public confidence, and there are a few areas that I would like to talk about here. I've already referenced that we police by consent. So those principles of policing by consent have had to remain throughout. Policing by consent is and remains, and I hope always will be, the cornerstone of policing in the UK and in particular Scotland. These Peel principles established very on in UK policing need to remain beyond the pandemic, and I'll come on to that slightly later. And we've continued to engage the public to understand their view on how we've been handling the pandemic. 33,000 people have reviewed our performance as part of the ongoing survey, and more than half, 58%, have confidence in policing, and 85% felt safe in their area. In the early days of our response to the COVID pandemic, we actually saw quite a large increase in public confidence, which was clearly something that was pleasing at that point in time. We also established an independent advisory group, which we established very early, and this was under John Scott, QC, and also included a whole range of community leaders from across the UK, academics and other specialists who were able to help us and to test and guide our response and our approach as we moved through the pandemic. And to help that, obviously, what these people in the IAG needed was data, and our data monitoring and scrutiny to look at trends and analysis has been very important. I think I'm right in saying that we were the first force in the UK to establish any kind of data monitoring for the use of the COVID regulations. And while it wasn't perfect in its early days and probably remains not perfect, at least it gave us an idea of what we were doing and allowed us to see those trends and analysis. In fact, John Scott, the chair of the IAG, described early teething problems as the police and public grappled with changing legislation and guidance. And I don't think that I would disagree with that, or that that's an unfair comment. But his conclusion was that Police Scotland have been using the powers where it has been proportionate and necessary on the far greater number of occasions. And finally, we speak about policing beyond the pandemic. We have a long existing relationship with the public, which has to continue beyond the pandemic as normal policing demands continue. And this is something that if we had gone into over-enforcement and lost that public trust and confidence, that would take a long time to recover beyond the pandemic. So it's right that our approach is proportionate, that it's necessary. And as I said, we will need to continue our conversations and relationships with the public well beyond the pandemic and our new normal. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. Okay, so now we move on to health and safety. home life, things have changed. Health and safety arrangements are different from what they were, as well as all the work that we did to talk to the public about how we were going to police the restrictions. We also had to make sure that our officers and staff were given the right equipment to do their jobs and to keep them safe. So our Health and Safety Department worked to provide the best PPE as quickly as they could, and we constantly updated our operational guidance to make sure that our officers were wearing the right equipment on each occasion. Many of our offices had to remain open, of course, to support the response and to ensure public still had access to policing services. And posters like the one you see here were put up all around the offices to make sure that physical distancing was maintained. And that's something that we had to work hard on, not just in our front counter offices, but in areas like our contact centre, where we had to reduce staffing levels, move desks, and like everyone else, adapt to the new rules. In the early days, we had real significant challenges around about PPE availability and the procurement. Like everyone else, even down to the NHS, there was a worldwide shortage of PPE availability. And we worked tirelessly along with our procurement team to try and source and provide PPE for our staff. Within Police Scotland, we adopted an FFP3 mask, which requires each individual to have an individual face fitting for that mask. Not every force has gone down this line, but we felt it was important to have that additional layer of safety. But with it, of course, came a significant challenge in terms of actually training officers and making sure that they were individually fitted for these masks. And across an area such as Police Scotland, with their urban, remote, rural areas, it was particularly challenging. And not just the fitting and training, but the supply of the PPE. We do not have large amounts of warehousing. We do not have a distribution network. So all that had to be developed in quick time. And a supply and resupply network established right across Police Scotland for PPE. One of the things that was interesting for me was the rise of departments which were very much seen in the corporate light before into the operational space. Our Health and Safety Department and our People and Development and HR functions really stepped up to the plate and really stepped into the operational space to provide guidance and support to frontline officers. And I think for me that's been a real win, and something that I hope to see done more in the future. I've already spoke a wee bit about some of the challenges we had in the police estates. We would see large groups of officers who had to attend an operational incident, perhaps with an individual resisting arrest, and those officers then going off through self-isolation. And so we established our own outbreak management team, and this outbreak management team performs a similar role to Test and Protect, helping to advise and direct officers as to when they should seek tests and when they should go off for self-isolation. And of course, one thing that's been important all the way through has been updating our health and safety operational risk assessments as we go. And of course, and very importantly, is recognising our own officer wellbeing. The pressure of lockdown has taken its toll on a lot of members in society, and our own officers and staff are no different. Trying to homeschool when schools are unavailable, and making sure that we offer the flexibility and support to our own staff as we move through the pandemic. Have the next slide, please. Thanks. And so we'll speak a wee bit now about the operational challenges that we have faced, and speaking predominantly about three areas: our operational response, our resourcing, and our deployment model. We have, of course, had our operational guidance from very early on. We're now in version 23 in terms of what I would refer to as the handbook for the pandemic. But of course, we can't include absolutely every scenario in there, and we cannot lay out exactly how everyone should respond in every circumstance, because by nature of policing, it's dynamic, it changes, and you're never quite sure what you're going to face. But there are certain things that we can look at. We can look at our approach to stop and search. We can look at how we attend sudden deaths, drink driving procedures, as I mentioned earlier, and the risk from aerosols as that procedure is undertaken. How do we watch persons in hospital, and what PPE should we wear? And so these are the types of things that were included in the operational guidance. From a resourcing perspective, we looked at a four-tier approach, which started from steady and worked through the different levels to critical. And that was about looking at when we would need to stop doing some functions and begin to move resources out onto the front line to make sure that those who required policing services could get them. And all in the early stages, we moved somewhere in the region of 575 officers from the back office to the front line and dedicated these officers into community areas to provide that visibility and reassurance. Some of the other things that we did, you may be familiar with our contact assessment model, which is a new way that we assess calls for service when they come in to our contact centre, which is much more threat and harm focused. And we accelerated our CAM rollout and we increased our resolution teams, who are teams within the contact command and control centre, who will deal with calls by telephone rather than sending a police officer, only where it's appropriate to do so and where the risk is low. And we rolled out CAM across Scotland quicker than we had anticipated and brought it online in the north of Scotland slightly earlier than we had anticipated. We looked at a deployment model as well, and we introduced a policy that reduced our attendance and only attended calls where it was absolutely appropriate to do so and there was a real need for a policing service. And we looked at limiting contact by doing things slightly differently, maybe asking neighbours to chap the doors of their homeowners to chap the doors of their neighbours to see if they'd seen anyone acting suspiciously for a vandalism or a low-level shed break-in, or asking shop owners to carry out their own CCTV inquiries and update us, to take statements over the phone and begin to reduce our contact. And that wasn't about trying not to deliver a service to the public. We had to consider that we were actually potentially the risk. The virus carriers who by going from house to house to premise could actually put the public at risk, as well as our own staff. We also looked at our proactive offences and our execution of warrants and began to reduce our proactivity, particularly during times when the infection rates are particularly high. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, the next couple of slides I won't go into too much. They just call out some of the data that you can see. And this is a weekly report, which is, and as I said, these figures are published. And we took the decision to publish proactively the data on the number of times that we've engaged with members of the public, including the number of fixed penalty notices that we've issued. When the legislation first came in, as you would expect, and quite rightly, a large number of people and outlets were looking for updates, and so for a transparency, it was easier just to publish that data. It was important to ensure that we were being open and transparent with the public, and like I said, this allows people to see locally what the enforcement looked like within their own division. Next slide, please. Thanks. Thank you. And what you're looking at here is a bit of a linear graph which takes us from the start round to where we are now. Again, I won't go into it in great detail, but you'll see a particular spike round about November as we move into December. And I think the thing that jumps out for me is that if you overlay this with our infection rates, our level of enforcement is actually not a million miles away from the infection rates. You'll see at the start in April that kind of first wave, and then our enforcement level drops off and then picks up again as we've come into the second wave over Christmas and through January and into February. And certainly we'll be keeping a close eye on what that looks like as we move forward. Next slide, please. Thanks. And the final kind of data slide that I want to cover really is there to show the number of times that we actually ask, inform or warn members of the public and seek their support to follow the guidance and to keep people safe. And it really is has been that last resort where we can't gain compliance, or as I said, as we move into the latter or 10 months in now, where there are real flagrant breaches, where we have Airbnbs and large house gatherings and parties, where we will move much quicker to enforcement. But you can see here from this pie chart, the largest number of people are either asked and comply, or are warned and then comply at that point in time. So, okay, if we can have the next slide, please. Ross, I'm going to take a small break. You'll be glad to hear, and I'm going to introduce Sergeant Kevin Dougal. As I said, Kevin was out there on the front line, unlike my good self, and so has a real good understanding of what it was like to try and take some of these policy decisions and strategic views and try and deliver that in the front line. So Kevin will talk to us for about 8 to 10 minutes just now. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I want to thank you for inviting me along today in order to give you an input regarding my experiences policing during the pandemic. I am particularly honoured to be talking to you as I'm a graduate of the University of Paisley, which I believe has since migrated into the University of the West of Scotland. I spent a number of fond years there. I've got good memories from my time there. After leaving university in the class of 2001, I worked for a year or so and then decided to apply for Strathclyde Police and joined in early 2003. I spent my first 12 years working in North Glasgow, predominantly in the Maryhill, Drumchapel and Saracen area, and then was fortunate enough to get promoted in 2015 to Sergeant, where I covered Glasgow East, working communities within Shettleston, Baillieston and Easterhouse. In March 2020, I was given the opportunity to complete an acting inspector's rank within the Cathcart area of Glasgow and the south side of Glasgow. It's an excellent opportunity. I was delighted. I was actually quite excited, and I was looking forward to it. However, the world was going in a different direction at this point in time. Things were changing, and by the time I arrived at Cathcart on my first day, the world, the country had been put into lockdown, and this announcement changed the way that we policed. Basic things like briefings. Officers have to be briefed at the beginning of every shift, and we have to start complying with social distancing. Now, it's 2021. We're all very aware what social distancing is. We know how to do it. However, I'm going to use a New York analogy. Three months prior to the initial lockdown, I was in New York with my family, walking through Times Square with tens of thousands of people, shoulder to shoulder. Social distancing didn't exist. Nobody knew what it was. So as police officers, as the public, we needed to start complying to this. The room which we conducted briefings in within Cathcart Police Office were too small. They weren't fit for purpose for social distancing, so we had to make changes. We took over the canteen within Cathcart Police Office. We installed IT, and we could brief comfortably 20 to 25 people, which was what we were usually doing anyway. Logistically, a lot of offices didn't have the comfort of moving office, so what I believe they done was entrusted officers to brief themselves at the beginning of every shift, just to keep them up to date as to what was happening within their area. When it came to briefing events, and events that still did take place during the pandemic, for example, the Scottish Cup final, within Cathcart I had to brief between 40 to 50 officers. Now, it wasn't possible to brief 40 to 50 officers within the office and social distance. Therefore, the decision I took was to perform an open air briefing. We commandeered the rear yard of the police office outdoors and briefed the officers for the Scottish Cup final. And thankfully, the weather was all right that day. The briefing, this was all done just to keep officers safe. If we keep officers safe, then they can keep the public safe. It should be noted that also at the end of every briefing, there was a new section added, and this was the rules and guidelines that were offered or administered or issued from the Scottish Government. These were changing daily. And things were getting added daily. So we had to ensure that officers were well up to date in what the public should be doing. The way in which we dealt with our daily business also changed. A presumption of non-attendance was one of the biggest changes I've seen in my service. This meant that officers would only attend calls that were absolutely necessary. As Mr Sutherland touched on earlier on, the contact assessment model, CAM as we called it, was rolled out within the Glasgow area, and this allowed service advisors to quickly identify the threat, the harm, the vulnerability of the officer, of the call, and have a proportionate and appropriate response. A series of questions were also asked via telephone regarding the COVID assessment, and a COVID assessment was made to see whether there was a risk to officers attending. The initial attending call suspected to be COVID. response officers were instructed not to attend because there was a lack of PPE at the beginning, and PPE was only issued to a flexible response unit, which was based at Jackton. So they attended in full PPE. As a result of this, however, it has to be noted that we had to reassure the public. Some of the public were quite frightened and unnerved at the fact that we're seeing police officers coming out of vans dressed in white suits, goggles, gloves, full PPE. They hadn't seen this before, so reassurance had to be given, and it had to be put out there that it was to protect the officers, it was to protect the public, and that's the only reason we were doing it. Quickly, however, local officers were fully trained, and it was very quick and supplied with suitable PPE so they could attend these calls and keep themselves safe and keep the members of the public safe. It was vital that the PPE had to be worn for officer safety. And in recent months, we've also seen a move that officers now wear masks when leaving the police office and within the cars, again to keep them safe. It's also very important that officers now clean their workstations after use and clean the motor vehicles after use. When they're finished at the end of the shift, clean the cars have got to be cleaned down. There's plenty of antiseptic in gels, etc., and the cars are cleaned at the end of every shift. Another thing that changed that made life quite easy, a bit easier for officers, is digital warrants. Now, to search a house for whether it be drugs, stolen property, pre-COVID, we had to apply for a warrant. Now, we still have to apply for a warrant. However, there was numerous different stages. The officer had to contact the duty officer at Force Control, who would contact the PF, who would contact the sheriff. There was numerous different stages we had to go through. This has since been streamlined, making it a lot easier to get warrants, however, without sacrificing any quality and standard. And I'm hoping this stays. Virtual courts were also set up. This is quite a big thing. If someone's arrested and they're held custody for the next lawful day, they usually attend, where I work in Glasgow Sheriff Court on the next lawful day. Virtual courts have now been set up to again allow social distancing. And the court, there's an office set up within the police office which links in with the court, and the business is done there and then. Other basic things which some people don't think about is refreshments. So officers still need to refresh during their shift, and suitable refreshment periods had to be given. Ordinarily, again pre-COVID, I would allocate 2 separate refreshment breaks for the shift, and half the shift would say take it at 6:30, the next would take it at 7:30. However, this would have to be staggered throughout the shift, again to allow social distancing. And it was reiterated and stipulated to officers that they shouldn't be going to other police offices to refresh, because this would only allow the virus to spread, and it was a greater risk. When it comes to absence management and welfare, this job became slightly more complex. As you can imagine, absence rates did rise significantly in some areas throughout the division. Clusters of outbreaks across the division meant, as an inspector, I had an overview of the areas, and where absence rates were higher, I had to redeploy officers according to call volume and demand. As an inspector, I also linked in with officers who were absent, giving them advice, reassuring them and updating them regarding the new details and new information that was constantly coming out from the Scottish Government. I was also looking after their welfare as well. Some officers lived alone, so I would check in with them every other day just to make sure they're okay, if they need anything, and to offer support looking after their welfare. With regards to welfare, again, it has to be noted that officers, we did have to change slightly, and officers had to take time off on some occasions to look after their family, emergency childcare. The schools were closed. Therefore, this had to be facilitated, and we had to look into giving officers special leave to spend time with their family, to look after their families. I'm often asked, and I have been asked, what types of calls and how the calls changed during the pandemic period. And what I would say is serious and violent crime decreased quite significantly, whereas what we class as, it comes up in our system as a public nuisance, which pre-COVID was house parties. All the figures for that almost doubled, and I took a snapshot between the 1st of March 2019 and the 1st of July 2020, and compared that to the following year, and it almost doubled. And that was in relation to COVID and people antisocial behaviour that was through COVID. However, what I would like to say is I'm also asked the same question about what people were like during COVID, what kind of reception did we get? And the vast majority of people did adhere to the lockdown restrictions. They did comply because they knew that the only way to get through this was to adhere to the restrictions. And as hard as it may be, they had to do it. You then got people who may bend the rules, and some of them genuinely didn't think they were doing anything wrong. And this is where, as I say, Mr. Sutherland spoke about earlier on, we had to engage and explain and encourage these people to start adhering to the rules, and enforcement was always a last resort. And then you did get a minority, and again I'll stress it was a minority of people who did not comply with the rules stipulated by the Scottish Government. And this is where you had to unfortunately go to the enforcement stage. I was involved in an incident within Glasgow city centre where an unlawful process took an unlawful demonstration took place. And unfortunately we had to go to an enforcement stage, and that is a last resort. However, it had to be done. What we'd like to say is in the last 10 minutes or so, I hope I've given you a brief snapshot or insight into the response, or being a response inspector, response officer during this pandemic. With introduction and distribution of vaccines, I'm hoping, like you are, that there's an end in sight. However, no matter what happens, I'm quite sure that we'll all be able to adapt in order to keep people safe and keep you all safe. I'll hand you over to Mr. Sutherland again.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I hope that's been useful for everybody to hear. I noticed that Kevin, like me, keeps talking about the past tense, of course, but we've still got a long way on this pandemic journey. Okay, Ross, if everybody's good to go, we can just move on to the next slide then, please. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So I'm now going to talk very quickly just about rural policing. One of the questions that routinely comes up was what was different for rural areas, and how did you have to change the response there? In some ways it was very different, and in other ways it was very similar. In terms of the legislation is the legislation, and so a breach is a breach. It's just about how we get there, how we reach and how we respond. It's slightly different. So from a resourcing perspective, obviously, given the reduced number of officers that we have in rural locations, any abstraction has a greater impact and has a different challenge. So providing cover when we have absences onto islands where ferries are required, or even just now during the period of heavy snow and bad weather, can of course provide us with a real issue. But then it's also worth calling that that's not something that our rural officers are not used to dealing with already. Again, it's just something that was heightened and continues to be heightened. From an officer safety perspective, in terms of that PPE element, we obviously, it was more challenging from a logistical perspective to get PPE and training out to areas to officers in more remote areas. And so we deliberately targeted the early rollout of training to the rural areas, and obviously the other issues that we have of arrested prisoners, and where there is an arrested prisoner requiring a large a big journey to one of our COVID custody centres, that obviously brings its issues as well. And from an operational perspective, in the early stages of the lockdown, you'll remember, it's hard to remember it as you see the snow outside just now, but you'll remember the good weather that we had for a sustained period of time. And so as regulations moved and changed, people were still allowed out and about, and everyone's daily walk became the thing, but people would want to take that further. So our beauty spots in our more remote and rural areas became overburdened with vehicles, hill walkers, breaching travel regulations to get out of the city. And a lot of this increased tensions within our rural communities, and that was one area that we had to be very careful about, and to seek partner support and to work with those communities. One of the big areas from that, which was well publicised at the time, was the use of second holiday homes and caravans, and people travelling large distances to visit holiday homes in the area. Can I have the next slide, please, Ross? Thanks.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
Oops, sorry.
No, you're all right. You're all right.
That is now.
No, I think it's still. Yeah, I think it's still stuck. It needs to go on one. Yeah, it's us. Thank you. So yeah, just to kind of finish off on the rural element, like everywhere else, as I said, there was the same issues. There was the same breaches. There was house parties and calls, and actually L Division, which is our Gael and Bute, has one of the highest enforcement kind of by head of population that we have in Scotland, and the operational challenges continued, and we've had a location that we've had to stand by up near Tyndrum for a number of weeks lately, and actually trying to get officers up into a remote area for a sustained period of time has been a real challenge. But as always, the key to success is not just about the police, it's about working in partnership, it's about engaging the community, it's about understanding the issues, and I think the work that's been done in the Lomond and Trossachs Park is a real kind of shining example of that, where those who run the Lomond and Trossachs Park, the local authorities, the ferry companies, those who are involved in licensing have all come together to manage that in a much better way now as we move forward. So can we move on, please? Thanks. Good stuff, thank you. And so just very quickly, when you look at some of the other challenges that we faced, and particularly here in Glasgow, so protest was not illegal in the first lockdown, but clearly gatherings of persons breached other COVID regulations, so by default it almost was. And it was a very difficult one for the police if you consider that ECHR Articles 9, 10 and 11 give a collective right to protest, and when you think that the police can only interfere with these rights under certain criteria, it leaves us in a bit of a dilemma. The police have had to and continue with the difficult task of balancing ECHR rights against the COVID regulations and the public health risk. You'll recall early on in the COVID journey, the Black Lives Matters and the statue protests we saw in Glasgow that really stirred the emotions in our communities and brought people out onto the street. And what we've required is a bit like our 4Es on a greater scale. Our approach has had to be consistent. It's had to focus on engagement and a proportionate and common sense policing approach. The deployment of our police liaison officers has been a real success, with many protests cancelled through positive engagement, and we've been encouraging people to move into the online space. Protest, of course, is now illegal under the current level of restrictions that we see. And while this provides clarity, it does not necessarily remove the problem, as some members of the public still insist on having their voice heard on matters that they feel very strongly about. And what we need to be careful about is that we are not seen to pick who is allowed to protest and who cannot. It is not for us to decide as such. And so what we do is take a holistic view of any protest. We look at the community tensions, the public safety element, and ensure that we have a proportionate policing response in place. Next slide, please, thanks. Thanks. Just a wee bit about crime and vulnerability, and Kevin mentioned the changing policing demands that we've seen over the course of the pandemic. Serious and violent crime has been reducing. The year-to-date figure, again, management figures and not official statistics, are 101 fewer serious assaults, 40 fewer robberies, and over 1,200 fewer victims of common assault, which of course is fantastic, but is very much influenced by COVID. But what we've not done is we've not faltered in our commitment to support vulnerable members of the community, whether that be children, people in mental health crisis, or victims of domestic abuse. Of course, in some ways there has been heightened risk as people have spent more time indoors with maybe less opportunities to come forward and report when they have been victims of crime. But actually what we've seen in Glasgow is that domestic crimes have increased slightly, whilst the number of incidents have reduced. And of course what we see is a trend in the reports that we get to the police during different periods of restrictions. And that's why we've continued to work very hard with our partners in the local authority and health and social care partnerships and third sector to try and make sure that any victims of domestic abuse and anyone who is vulnerable in their own home is getting the assistance that they need. Kevin alluded to the antisocial behaviour increase that we've seen, and we've seen that consistently through the pandemic, more so in the summer months, of course, as is traditional. But we've seen over 13,000 additional reports within Greater Glasgow in the financial year to date, and of course most of them are COVID related. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. Okay, as we begin to kind of draw to a close, just a few things just to finish on, a couple of slides to finish. Some of our other considerations, Kevin again referenced the criminal justice, and we had to look strategically at the outset about how we would actually deliver our own custody centres, and in the early stages developed COVID custody centres where people who were displaying symptoms, self-isolating, stated they had COVID could be taken to, and additional PPE and additional measures were in place there for safety. But with the criminal justice effectively coming, the criminal justice system coming to a halt effectively in the first lockdown, what we now have for the future, of course, is a backlog in cases that are being heard at court and a build-up of citations and countermands. So, like a lot of areas, what we've seen is a backlog that will, of course, need to be met, a hidden demand that will need to be met at a future point in time. Another thing that's worth referencing is the tiered approach that we were in for so long, where we saw different areas of the country and different areas of lockdown. And of course, that presented a unique challenge for us, where we were having to deploy policing approaches in different local authority areas that were very different. Of course, in one area, for instance, for a long period of time, Glasgow City Council was in a different tier from Eastern Bartonshire. So as one division, we were having to deliver different policing approaches in terms of guidance and regulations across a very small boundary. And from a training impact, what we've seen in the organisation, of course, is a cancellation of courses or a postponement of courses, which again is future demand for us to meet. But of course, there has been some positives from that, as we are today on Microsoft Teams, finding new ways of working. And some courses, of course, have been taken into the online space, and we're finding new ways of meeting that demand. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so what's next then? What are the challenges that we are likely to see? So when you look at that first bullet point, I mean, how do we support the social and economic rebound in a positive manner? Well, in Greater Glasgow, myself and colleagues sit on the Social Recovery Task Force, along with a whole range of partners, looking at what the future might be as we begin to step out of the stringent lockdown once again. And beyond that, how do we build a Glasgow city where people feel safe, secure, and it's an inviting public space? What will change? What will the city centre even look like? What will our demand profile look like? Will we, as we begin to come out of lockdown, we will need to work closely with the Scottish Government and local authorities to carefully return our cities to a place where people can fully exercise their rights, socialise, shop and gather. And from an organisational perspective, what have we learned? What is next? We have, of course, like many organisations, found a much more agile and much more dynamic way of progressing, of making decisions, of bringing in change, of bringing in new policies. And we recognised this very early on, and actually formed a renewal and continuous improvement group under the Silver Commander ACC Spears. And there's been a whole framework of work which has continued to progress even through the kind of second wave of the pandemic, looking at what have we done differently that we would want to keep and we would want to maintain. Health and safety playing a much bigger part in our day-to-day operational policing, as I've already referenced, and I think that's something that will continue. Like most organisations, the move to home working, we've issued many thousands of laptops and IT equipment to make sure that people can work from home, and moving forward we will want to look at who would want to continue working from home, who can work from home, and what blended model it might support, particularly a lot of our police staff. The flexible deployment models that we've spoken about, reducing contact when we have either significant absence or at peak times of demand, is something that we can now switch on and off, again supported by the CAM model, which makes sure that those who are most at risk of harm and the most vulnerable still get a policing service when they need it. And looking forward to our digital contact. So during the last couple of months, we've brought in an online form where people who are phoning to report breaches of COVID regulations can do so via an online form. And of course, we know that the future, the public will want to interact with the police in a different way, and changing and improving that digital contact will be particularly important. Last slide, please. Thanks, Ross. Okay, so in general terms, the response from the public, I have to say, has been fantastic. The Chief Constable has asked time and time again for the public to take personal responsibility, to do the right thing, to stay home and to save lives, and the public have listened. I also want to recognise our own staff, especially those in the front line, who have been exceptional. Our staff are people with their own personal challenges, but yet they've worked tirelessly in changing circumstances to deliver what I think is a very professional public service.